a cohort approach on determinants and differentials between young and old married women in India. As I said, I'm Kakoli and I'm presenting this work on behalf of my co-authors. Two of them are already here in this room. So just to give you a context about the work that we are doing, we all know that contraceptive needs may vary depending on women's age and parity. But for India or in many other developing countries, these two may not be the only factors that determine when women will use any method, when they will switch to another method, or they will continue or discontinue any method. So in India, we have seen that a lot of women initiate any method once having one child or maybe after having two children. So over time, it is also seen that this has been changing, but a lot of work still needs to be done. In the recent past, a lot of work has been done to educate the women at younger parity, to educate them on the importance of contraception, importance of initiating at an early age to achieve better results in terms of contraception use. We are also seeing the results, but there is still a lot to be achieved. It is also true that women will not use the same contraception throughout their reproductive span. Depending on their need, they may switch or they may stop using. But what is more important is that women are using the correct method at the correct time. So as I said, women may switch or stop using, so we should also know what made women make this decision to switch or limit their method. So in this paper, we are trying to see what could be the factors that help women decide going from one method to another using a large-scale study done in India. So basically, we are trying to answer two questions. First is, what is the association of parity and desired family size with the choice of limiting or spacing method? And the second is, what are the factors that determine women's sustained use of contraception and transition from spacing to limiting method? So we are using the DHS survey in India, which is also known as the National Family Health Survey for India. I'm using the five rounds of NFHS for showing the trends and patterns. But for the second research question, I'm depending more on the last round of NFHS, and I'm using the calendar data, the DHS contraceptive calendar data that gives a more detailed information on women's contraceptive use. I'm comparing the trends for 15 to 24 against 25 and above age group. These are some of the indicators that we have calculated from the contraceptive calendar. Proportion of months used any method, proportion of months pregnant, proportion of months non-use, sustained use of any method, and transition to limiting method. So just to inform you about the data that I have used, we have used the reproductive calendar for women who were married within 5 years of the survey, so that we can track their uses starting from marriage to the first use to the all their uses episodes throughout these 5 years. So we restricted these to the currently married women who ever used any method and who got married in the 5 years before the survey was conducted. So as I said in the introduction, that some changes have been observed in the initiation of parity. So if you see the 15 to 24 age group, we see that at the first round of NFHS, 22% women reported initiating at parity 0. This remains the same overall. So coming to the last round of NFHS also, 20% women only reporting initiation at parity 0. This is good that this is not going down, but still there is scope to improve further. But what we also see is that women at parity 1 is also reporting use, which is increasing consistently, which was 37% in the first round of the survey, but it has changed to 55% coming to the most recent round of the survey. If we look at the other age group, 25 and above, we see that in the first round of the survey, 61% women reported using any method after having 3 or more children, which is a concern for us. But over time, it is changing, and you see that coming to the last round of NFHS, 29% women reported using at parity 3 and above. What is interesting is that the percentage of women using this method at earlier parity is increasing. Like from here, if you see, it has come to 34%. So if we say that women are initiating any method at parity 3 and above, it means that after achieving their desired family size, they are directly going for a limiting method. They may not be using any method in their entire reproductive span, and they wait till the time they reach their desired family size, they are satisfied, and they go to a limiting method straight. So once I say that women initiate any method, so it is also important to see which method women are using and women are reporting. So the first is parity 0. And if we see, I have divided these as short acting, long acting, limiting and traditional methods. So if we notice here that from the first round of NFHS, the use of short acting methods is increasing among women of parity 0. Earlier it was dominantly traditional methods, but now it is changing to short acting methods, and this is also same from parity 1. Over time, more women are using short acting methods. Then when we move to the higher parity women, parity 2, 3 and above, so we see that it is dominantly limiting method. So it is also clear from the previous slide that when women are opting for any method after 3 or more children, they are more likely to go for a limiting method. What is interesting is that there are certain percentage of women who are still using traditional method even at the parity 3 and above. So when we looked at the factors that may be associated with why this behavior we have noticed, we see that desired family size, like there is a question on how many children you want if you never had a child. Just imagine that you don't have a child and how many children that you would like to have in your lifetime. So depending on that question, some would say 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we look at that, then with the increasing number of children, women are less likely to use any method, or they are more likely to use a limiting method. It is like the permanent method, the sterilization, yeah, male or female sterilization. Yeah. So after looking at the methods they are using, as I said, I have used calendar data to calculate these proportions. Before going to the results, I would just like to say that in the calendar data, I restricted the data for 5 years, and I have observed women who got married during this period. And as many of you may know how the calendar data gives information, it gives information for every month for those 5 years. For which, every month, one method is mentioned for each woman. So if a woman is using pill, say, for 3 months, so it will be 3 months of pill, then the next method, then the next method. So it makes easier to see their behavior. On an average, if overall pattern we see, then it may not be very clear that when the switching is happening, when initiation is happening. So this calendar data is very helpful in terms of analyzing their behavior. So we calculated the total number of proportion of months using any method. So this line shows that when a woman initiate any method earlier in their marriage, like immediately 1 month after getting married, if they are using any method, so they are like higher proportion of months they are spending in using. I'm not saying here that they are continuously using the same method. There may be a month of non-use or 2 months of non-use, but overall proportion when we see, if I observe a woman for 50 months, 85% of the months she is spending in using any of these methods. So it is going down when the initiation is at a later stage at marriage. After looking at the total number of months used in the 5 periods, we wanted to see what is the longest duration of sustained use. For sustained use, I have used a definition that if a woman is using a method consistently for more than 3 months, then we will include that woman as a sustained user, because there are different durations for which a method gives you the protection. Like a pill has to be taken every day, but a injectable will give you a longer duration of protection. So for inclusion criteria, we have used 3 months or more than 3 months of use as a sustained use. So here also we see that women who initiate early, they are more likely to have a longer period of sustained use, and it goes down when the initiation start at a later time after marriage. So what is the method that women use for a longest time? So dominantly it is condom that women have reported. for both the age groups, condom has come out as the longest used method, followed by pill and IUD. But if we look at the uses by the economic status, we see that for the richer women here, the women coming from the richest household, their uses of condom as the highest use method is relatively higher compared to the other women. But for the women from the poor households, they are still depending on pill or lamb. So there is a differential we will notice here since the graphs have shifted from this direction to the opposite direction. So just summarizing this slide, 50% women reported condom as the highest used method, the longest used method rather, pill as the second method and IUD as the third method. And condom is the highest sustained method for the economically well off, and pill and lamb are the highest sustained method for the poor people. So what are the factors then? What are the factors that determine women's longest use of any method? So after controlling for the main variables, uh, age, education, wealth index, their socioeconomic status like the religion, caste, etc., we see that months at which women have initiated any method, like if the duration is increasing, they are less likely to have a longer episode of sustained use. Like before going to this, we have identified how many episodes women might have in their reproductive calendar. So there may be women with only one event of sustained use. There may be women with more than one event of sustained use. But here we have taken the longest event which any woman has reported. Like in the previous slide, we saw that on an average 18 to 20 months women have reported as their longest period. So we picked that duration and tried to see what are the factors associated with this. Then we wanted to see, after using any method for a longer duration, how women are moving from a spacing method to a permanent method, moving to sterilization. So there are three types of transitions we noticed. One is after using spacing method. It means that women are using spacing method for a certain period of time before they move to a limiting method. After a period of non-use, it means that women are not using any method for a certain period of time and then they are going for a limiting method. And after giving birth means that after giving their last childbirth, women are going directly for a limiting method. This is same, the pattern is same for both parity 2 and the higher parity. Like more than half of the women are going after giving birth to their last child, and after non-use is slightly different, but the pattern remains overall the same. So then what is the average duration that women is spending before going for a limiting method? So using spacing method, it means that overall 5 months. On an average, women are spending 5 months using a spacing method before they opt for a limiting method. Then this is slightly different for parity 2 and parity 3 and above. So here less than 5 months and here more than 6 months women are spending before they're going for a sterilization. After giving birth is same. So after giving birth to their last child, women are waiting on an average 1 month before going for sterilization. What is most striking is that after a period of non-use, like on an average 6 months or more than 6 months, women are not using any method, but they have in their mind that they would go for sterilization, but they are still not using any method. And after waiting for 6 months, they are going for sterilization. So here in the calendar period that we observed for the 5 years, as I mentioned in my previous slide, we observed 3120 events of transition, and 52% and 42% are the types of transitions that we noticed. And as I said, on an average 6.3 months of non-use. And what happens is that if a woman is not using any method for more than 6 months, then this will put them to a risk of unintended pregnancy. Then we used a multinomial logistic regression to see what could be the factors that determine or factors associated with women's transition. Then here also we see that the women in the poor households, poor economic strata are more likely to be in a status of non-use. Also here as using a spacing method, but they are not going straight from birth to limiting. And with parity, the chances are less. Like with the higher parity, women are going straight from giving birth to limiting method. So just to summarize what we have observed and the key learnings from this is that there is a need for FP program to focus on newly married women for early initiation of contraceptive use, as it leads to better contraceptive use behavior, because this is what we have observed throughout the presentation, that early initiation makes sure that they are using more, they are spending more time using a method. There is more likelihood that women will use a method for a longer period. They are sustaining their use, so everything is supposed to be good if we make women initiate a method earlier. So condom is the most preferred method of sustained use, but there is a need to promote other modern methods as a basket of choice through IEC around advantages, disadvantages, and side effect management. Women who transition from a period of non-use to limiting are potential groups for intervention to reduce risk of unintended pregnancy, and integrating FP during ANC could contribute to enabling women make informed decision and adopt postpartum contraception. So yeah, so this is where I end my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Got loads of questions on that. It's really interesting. Let's go though to the second presentation before we go into questions. So this presentation is by Holly Baxter. It's called Catalyzing Change, Implications of a Qualitative Network Study in Rural Nigeria. Holly is the Associate Professor at the University of California, San Diego Center for Gender, Equity and Health. That's right. And your focus area is social networks, social norms across geographic contexts, and has been working with and funded by USA, Gates and others. Holly, I don't know if you prefer the mic or just work from there. Let me give you, you've got the clicker, yeah, brilliant.
Good afternoon. We're way down at the end of the line of the convention center here, so thank you all for making it down this far. I kept walking and like, oh my God, we are at the very, very end. So I suspect that has impacted our audience numbers a bit. This is going to be a very different presentation than what we just saw. Context completely different, methodology completely different, and it's not really focused on life course so much. It's more focused on sort of contextual factors that impact fertility decisions and aspirations in rural Niger. So it's always interesting to start off presentations on Niger by just contextualizing it, because Niger is sort of way at the end of one spectrum in terms of fertility behaviors and outcomes. So 79% of girls in Niger are married by the age of 18. 10% of them have given birth before the age of 15. 69% give birth before the age of 20. And what we have there is a fertility rate of 7 births per woman, 186 per 1,000 adolescent fertility rate. So not surprising in this context, modern contraceptive use is not very high. 12% prevalence among all married women, and for adolescents, that's at about 6%. So we're looking at very low contraceptive use, very early marriage with the idea of starting women on their childbearing trajectory early, and therefore we have really, really high fertility rates in this context. So Niger right now is like a basket of interventions. All sorts of organizations are coming in, have been coming in to try and work on this situation, to give opportunities to women to use family planning with the hope of potentially reducing this fertility rate. Obviously, this is a tricky situation. If people go in telling women to use family planning and reduce their family size, then this is really just top-down dictatorial approach to helping women with their fertility. On the other hand, when you have such a high fertility rate, there's obviously deep-rooted problems that are the result of that in terms of education, in terms of feeding children, in terms of provision of health care and whatnot. So programs are coming in and trying different approaches. Community-based family interventions can be effective, but they're very, very resource intensive. It takes a lot of people to come in, to be constantly going around to different households, talking to women, whatnot, and they're also hard to scale. So what's working in one situation, how do you sort of blow that out across a wide swath of the population in a way that's going to work for women of different ages, women from different ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic conditions? Social norms theory is an important consideration when thinking about these kind of community-based approaches. So I'm sure many of you know that in the past few decades, social norms approaches have become much more popular and people are thinking a lot about social norms. Well, why is that? Well, you could take a woman, you can go in and you can find a 16-year-old in Niger and you can pull her out and put her into this program and tell her wonderful things about family planning and reducing family size and whatnot. And she can be very enthusiastic and answer all your survey questions really nicely at the end of the day. And, oh, it looks like the program was a great success. And then you just like plop her back into her community. And, oh, guess what? She is completely surrounded by other people who did not go through the program, and the social norms have not changed, then the social pressures have not changed, and therefore the behavior doesn't change as a result. And so social norms theory and the application of social norm theory to social behavior change interventions in general has become popular. But there's still a lot of difficulties in how are we measuring norms, how are we integrating social norms into these programs. How do we know if this is really successful, and what approach are we going to take? One approach, work that I do a lot, is using social networks. So social norms that people hold within communities are held within networks, and I like to think of the networks as sort of being the structure, the scaffolding that hold the norms together. And so when we can understand that infrastructure and that the structure of the community and how people interact and are interrelating, we can have a better idea of how social norms are working within communities and maybe get a sense of how we can leverage them to help people achieve their long-term goals. So the study that I'm going to describe, I'm really presenting the formative research for this study. This is a Gates-funded project. It's called Tipping Point. And the focus is, the overall question is, can a focused approach using social networks increase the impact of a community-based family planning program? And then can this approach be scaled? So really the fundamental of this particular program is testing a social network-based adaptation of a program that's already going to be rolled out within communities. So the program that we're working with here is something called Kulawa. It is funded by USAID. It's a massive integrative health program. It's covering huge swath of rural Niger in Zindir and Mardi, many, many, many villages, and potentially reaching millions of women. There is a youth-based family planning, community-based intervention approach that's being rolled out into this. And this is that approach, this community-based family planning approach for married adolescents is what we are tweaking and testing in this Tipping Point study. So we're going to have 3 arms in the study. One is the standard programming that they're doing. One is the social network adaptation that we're doing a tweak of, and then we're doing some control villages, which will actually be really helpful because we can actually look to see if even the standard approach that they're using is going to be useful and impactful. So to create this social network approach, we need to go in and understand what seems to be the best perspective that we can take in order to create a network approach that's actually going to be useful. We can't just go in and make assumptions about how we think the network is working and then throw together an approach. So we did a lot of formative research, and I'll be describing that today. The formative research questions are, first, what are the composition and characteristics of interpersonal social networks around fertility and family planning use in these communities with a focus on young married adolescents? What are the social norms informing fertility and family planning decisions? And how are those social norms held within these networks? And what are the sanctions for violating those norms? And are there opportunities within these social systems for change? So we collected a lot of data to inform our baseline survey and to inform intervention development. We did 24 qualitative social network interviews. So most of the time you see social network analysis being done, it's in quantitative surveys, and there's, certain methodologies, and if you've, ever seen presentations around it or read papers around it, you have a general idea of what quantitative social network analysis is. But in this case, this was qualitative social network interviews, where we sit down with the person, we have a survey tool, we ask them questions around their network, and then we sit and we lay this out on a map in front of them. We draw the network, we put little symbols for different people, and then we ask them, basically we do then an individual qualitative interview with them, asking them questions about their norms, about the people in the networks, about their decisions and whatnot. And then we also did 10 focus group interviews. When we did the qualitative interviews, we started with 12 focal participants. So these were 8 females and 4 males. They gave us the names of people in their social networks, and then we went and interviewed one person from each individual's social networks. So here's what we did, though actually I think level 3 is wrong, I apologize. So we had 8 females, and we interviewed people from their networks, and we had 4 males, and we interviewed 4 people from their networks. Oops. Okay, so results. What is the structure and makeup of social networks in this context? So here's the gender breakdown of our participants. So egos are the ones that we call our focal participants. So the first people that we interviewed, sort of the seed people in social network lingo, are called egos. So we just know that's where we started. And then alters, we had 12 alters, because we had 12 egos, 1 alter per individual. And an alter is just, again, a social network lingo for a person that's been nominated by someone else. So if someone came and interviewed me, and I named my colleague Shweta, who's sitting right there, I'd be the ego. Shweta is the alter. So we interviewed me, and then we went and interviewed Shweta. So the average age by category, and this was interesting. So our female egos are young adolescent, young women. The average age was 21. Their husbands were 33. So they're already 11, 12-year age difference in each year, which is quite common. Then we see that the people that they nominated, the women were quite a bit older than the initial seed participants. Their average age of 34, and the same for men. The men that were nominated in these networks were older. So pretty much most of the people in this case were nominating older alters, and these were the ones that we ended up interviewing. This is degree. Degree means the number of people nominated in someone's network. This was lovely because we could see, doing this qualitatively, we had the time to really get comprehensive network interviews with people, and we were able to see a lot of differentiation around what kind of people were nominated and how. And we saw that women, on average, the egos, were nominating around 17 people, and the men were nominating around 19. So they had large, diverse networks, a lot of people that they were interacting with in their families and communities. The alters, who were older people, nominated quite a few less. And we're not entirely sure why that is, but it could be possible that as people get older, there aren't as many people that they look up to for decision making and influencing, which is what a lot of our questions were around, and that may be why the networks were somewhat smaller. We asked people questions about decision makers and influencers, and we make this distinction because when you're thinking about social networks and you're thinking about social norms, there are people who make decisions for you, especially in strongly hierarchical societies. So your mother may say, you will get married, and she's making that decision for you. You may have friends as a young adolescent girl who are saying, oh, why aren't you married? Oh, I just got married. Oh, it's so great if you get married. And that person would be an influencer. That person's not making the decision for you, but they're talking in your ear and you're listening to them. So you may be influenced by what they say, even if you're not necessarily doing what they tell you to do. So there's this distinction between influencers and decision makers that we were considering when we were doing this data collection. And here we just see across different relationship types who people nominated as decision makers. So we see that women were we see that men, all of them nominated their mother as a decision maker. All the men nominated their mother. Women, not so much. Well, by this time, these women were married, so they're living with their mother-in-laws. They may not have as much chance to interact with their own mothers. Both were nominating fathers, as a matter of fact. And then women did nominate their mother-in-laws and their father-in-laws, and you see that men didn't at all. So men don't care what their wives' parents think in this context. But men very much cared about what their uncles thought. Uncles had a lot of decision-making power. So what are the social norms around fertility in this context? Well, here we get to the crux of the issue here in these communities, which is that large family size is a universally acknowledged social norm within this population. Everybody acknowledged it. Everybody talked about it. Having a large family is very important, and for men, it's a sign of strength, of wealth. For women, of being fertile, of being able to care for your family. There was a lot of positive normative value around having large families. They also feel that large families are going to help them with work that they need to be doing, to help them take care of them when they're older. So there are many reasons that people wanted to have large families. And they also anticipated sanctions. So they may themselves think having a large family might be helpful in my old age, but they're also concerned about the fact that people are going to speak negatively about them or have a poor opinion of them if their family sizes are small. Their mothers and mother-in-laws may criticize them. People in the community may have things to say about it. So this is something that a lot of people feel the pressure to have a large family because of these social norms. Who has influence and power over fertility decisions? Husbands was the number one. What a husband thinks, that's what's going to happen. If the husband wants a larger family, then the woman needs to have bear more children. If the husband doesn't want to use family planning, then the woman shouldn't use family planning. So women and men both talked about the fact that men have this control and this authority over family size and use of contraception. But we also get into this aspect. So it seems, and I'll tell you, it was kind of funny. So when I went out into the field to do practice interviews with our team, and I was with the male interviewer, and so we were talking to men, and the men would all say, oh, nobody makes a decision for me. Oh, I make all the decisions. I'm my own person, blah, blah, blah. And they would say things like this. And then as we started probing and talking to them more, suddenly it turns out that they actually cared quite a bit about what their mothers thought, and in fact would comply with what their mother wanted from them. So we see that mother-in-laws and mothers have tremendous power over fertility decisions. Even though women didn't nominate their mothers as often in the network map, in our qualitative interviews, there was a lot of discussion from young women about the influence of their mother. Their mother was also telling them that they should have more children. Mothers had a lot of say over whether they used family planning or not. So mother-in-laws and mothers were both very strong decision makers and had a lot of authority in this context. Men respect their mothers regarding fertility decisions. If a man's mother really is strongly convinced of something in this context, he will listen to her to some extent. This is this was an important point in terms of what we decided and how we thought through how we were going to plan our intervention. Oops. We also found that people did talk quite a bit about friends and extended family as being sources of information for family planning and people with whom they would just discuss these topics. So even though friends and these extended family weren't necessarily decision makers, they did seem to have quite a bit of influence. So opportunities for change. Family planning in general seem to be pretty well accepted. There have been quite a few programs over the years that have come in and talked to people about family planning. So people didn't seem to be skeptical about family planning in general, but the issue was more around family planning had to be done under the right context. So it wouldn't make sense for a woman to start family planning before she'd had a baby. She needs to prove her fertility. Women shouldn't be taking family planning without the permission of their husbands. So these were the kind of ideas that came out. So in general, people said, oh yeah, okay, it's okay. You can go to the health clinic if your husband's with you. You can take family planning if you've already had a child or two. So family planning in general there was generally positive impressions of family planning. And people were starting to talk about the fact that large family size could be a liability because of the need to feed the children, because of the need to give the children an education, to clothe the children. Some of the mother-in-laws mentioned that it's the responsibility of a son's parents to take on care of children that if her son and his wife can't care for them. So there's a lot of stress and burden on older, the in-laws in the case of large families. So even though large family size is still something that people are really sort of attached to and oriented towards, there's more and more conversation around reducing family size. And I think the issue here is really helping people see ultimately what is their goal. Do they want a healthy family? Do they want healthy children? Do they want children that can take care of themselves when they get older? And when thinking about it from that perspective, people are able to see that, well, maybe this norm of large families isn't really serving that end purpose, isn't really serving what ultimately we want for our families and for our communities. So we saw that there's a possibility of mothers-in-laws as agents of change because that sons will listen to their mothers, because mother-in-laws can work with their daughter-in-laws to facilitate use of family planning. That was mentioned quite a few times. If a husband is against it, then she can go talk to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law may have that influence. So we did see that there's this possibility of mother-in-laws as agents of change. So key learnings: large family size is the norm, but this is slowly changing due to economic stress. Family planning is generally accepted under the right circumstances. For instance, the husband agrees and the couple has children already. Husbands are primary decision makers around fertility. However, his mother and her mother both have a lot of influence. And friends can be a trusted source of information and conversation. So next, we took all this information. We created a baseline survey. The baseline survey was just finished. We worked with our partners in Niger, both the implementer and our research partners, to think through what the adaptation of the intervention should be. And what we decided was for an approach that involves mother-in-laws in the family planning community intervention. This includes small groups. It includes household visits and community dialogues. So mother-in-laws will be brought into this. And then as part of it, the young women who are engaged in the program will also be told, or they will suggest to them to tell their friend, pick one friend, and talk to this friend about that. So it's a peer diffusion, but then the intensive programming will also include mother-in-laws. So that's what we decided to do with this intervention. We've just trained the community health workers that will be starting, and the intervention hopefully should actually be starting in a couple months. And we'll see how we do. We are collecting baseline data, midline data, and endline data, which includes social network data on everybody. So we'll be able to see whether whether this information is diffusing, whether our approach, the social network approach, is actually more impactful than the standard approach. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Holly. Thanks, Holly. Yeah, really interesting presentations. Very different contexts, but about behaviours. Wonder if there's any questions on either presentation or comments more widely about what you heard, whether you found it surprising, interesting, those of you working in similar or same field, whether you're seeing the same kind of results. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My question is for Holly. I wanted to understand how much of this sort of takes away the onus from the husband and shifts it to the mother and the mother-in-law. And what about, sort of addressing social norms and sort of focusing on gender transformative practices?
So, is it working? Okay. Yeah? I guess. Yes. Okay. So actually, thank you for asking that. I didn't go into a huge amount of depth on the program because I wanted to actually spend time just on the qualitative interviews. But the program itself is actually designed, it's a couples program. So men are actually an equal part of this. There are home visits, small groups, and community dialogues. This all involves men. So every young woman that's engaged in the program, her husband is also engaged. And the programming does include gender transformative dialogue and perspectives. Now, this is tricky. I think a lot about these gender transformative approaches because the gender inequity in this setting is so deeply deeply rooted, and it's the way we think of gender transformative versus what they think is gender transformative is, I think, a bit at odds. So that, for instance, most of the people that actually work in our program, when I gave them a little survey, they all believe that women should unilaterally obey their husbands. And these are the people that are actually implementing the program. So gender transformation, I think it's very small and incremental, but it's definitely a part of the program, and men are certainly involved. The hope is that by pulling the mother-in-law in, we're creating sort of a triad of normative change rather than just having the onus being on the young woman herself.
Great. Yeah, great question at the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations, both presentations. I just wanted to ask the last presentation in Nigeria. You mentioned that one of the questionnaires you administered, the men or the husband had more influence, and you kind of referred to only fertility rate. Is there another question or questionnaires that you might have discussed and the husbands, I'm sorry to say men, but the husbands have more influence? So was there another question in regards to, gauging the influence from the men or the husbands? The second question I wanted to ask is, again, the opportunities that you presented that are available during the research. We see that there's an opportunity because there's already economic bites that are coming up, and how does that relate in terms of where the study took place, like, for example, urban versus rural, and maybe the level of education? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you restate your first question? I didn't entirely understand it.
So there's one of your responses where you said the husbands have influence in terms of fertility rates. And you gave an example of one question that you used to gauge that respondents. Was there another question? Or yeah, thank you.
Oh, you mean, were there more questions around that? Okay, so these were qualitative interviews. We actually did vignettes, and there was a whole different, there were a whole series, and we had focus group discussions. So we had younger men, older men, we had women, actually youngest women, so adolescents, women who were sort of in their 20s, and then older women, older women who I think we were like 30 and above, or maybe 35 and above. So we had a broad spectrum of conversations and questions with people around this in the qualitative work. And then we've also asked quite a few like series of these kinds of questions in our baseline survey as well. And then the other question you asked was, did we see differences in terms of socioeconomic status? Well, so all of the interviews that we did and all of this work has been in rural areas. So we're not having the opportunity in this particular study to contrast between rural and urban, although there generally seem to be an understanding, as in most parts of the world, that the urban communities are going to be a bit more progressive, that they're going to be more open to family planning, that family size is smaller and whatnot. What we mostly saw was pretty strong differences across villages. So there seems to be normative differences in these communities in certain kinds of practices and norms from community to community. So more than big differences that we saw in terms of socioeconomic status, of course, people who are more educated are more likely to use family planning. They may be a little more gender equitable, but we certainly saw big differences across communities, just in clusters.
Great. Any other? Yeah, great. Another question here.
Hi. Okay. So I don't have a question, just a reflection, especially on your presentation, because we at ICRW, we are also doing very similar study in India. I think some point we'll definitely like to connect on this. And one of the things about this whole triad of husband, wife, and mother-in-law, and what we also found there is, it's also about their individual aspiration or what they really want, and depending on if they are aligned. So husband, son and mother, if their opinion around family size is aligned, of course it's a much stronger force and a pressure for women. And then they keep shifting the responsibility to, I'm getting influenced by the other person, and the vice versa. But the moment you'll see that there is a disconnect between their, maybe son wants fewer children than the mother, then the whole dynamics again change and shifts. And there is a likelihood of that younger women getting more support if both husband and wife have similar aspiration vis-a-vis mother. So in the triad, it's a moving dynamics that you'll find. And also it also depends what sort of position within the household relationship that mother-in-law and the husband acquires. If husband is head of the household, he'll have much more power, and even if there are differences in opinion, his opinion will sustain and stay compared to the mother-in-law. So it's a lot of dynamics, and people also use those relationship and dynamics to propagate their own aspiration and their own opinion without really conflazzing around who is more influenced. So it's always important to really try to unpack what is really happening there. So.
Well, thank you for that. So in our survey, our baseline survey, we actually interviewed husbands, wives, mother-in-laws, and then one social network partner from each mother-in-law, so we could understand the mother-in-law's networks. So Shweta tomorrow will be presenting 2 different presentations using our baseline data, and one of which talks about some of what you were just suggesting, like how much concurrence there is between husband, mother-in-law, and what that impacts, what is self-efficacy, IPV. So if you, Shweta has 2 different presentations tomorrow using this data if you're interested. So thank you for that. Yes, we've been thinking a lot about these things and like what the how this all plays out within the household, because under certain circumstances it's going to be different, and we can capture that if we sort of do our surveying correctly and we do our analysis correctly, to really not look at it as a monolith like you're saying, but to understand how those different dynamics can shift the behaviors and aspirations.
Great. Any other questions? Great. At the back.
Yeah, it's just a simple question, and I think I'll ask it to both presenters. In a lot of the work we do, it's important to understand your context as you get into, especially in SRH family planning. So looking at what you presented, with your understanding going into the context before you started these studies, was there anything that you found in your results that was unexpected or different from the obvious that you knew going in?
So, yeah, very good question. Okay, should we start with Kagoli?
Thank you. So, based on what we observed, is that we did not find something which we, I would say, not expect. This is in the same direction of like how we see the contraceptive use of women over times, but we see some changes. Like what it used to be earlier, the behavior is changing a little bit, but that is also very evident from other like studies and work that we are doing also, that yeah, these changes are happening, and now the effort is to make these changes like more like frequent or more evident, so that we achieve what we want to achieve at the end of this. So yeah, I would say nothing unexpected from this.
Just on that. Oh,
Like I'm part of like the co-author
Yeah.
for this. I just want to add. So like in the quantitative, as Kakuli is sharing, there's not much of like, it's a change, but not an unexpected. But part of that study, we have also done the qualitative study, and we are also observing the changing relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, which we have not really often understood and examined in the context of reproductive and sexual health. And what we are finding, I'm talking very specific to Indian context, in state of UP and Bihar, northern state, where we also seeing that mother-in-laws who have experienced like a lot of pressure to have bigger family size, like, there's a lot of demand for son, how they are creating space within the household to support women. I mean, it hasn't changed totally, but it's like change in terms of like recognizing the pressure they had and seeing how they can support still their daughter-in-law to overcome some of the larger normative pressure of larger family size. I think the change hasn't happened that, they start really putting the onus on the son. They're still putting the onus on the daughter-in-law, but they're trying to create more space and support so that younger women can also achieve their desire for smaller family size, which is more in line to the mother-in-laws as well.
yeah, it's really interesting. Just before coming on to Holly, I found from the presentation one thing that surprised me. I just wonder if you comment on it. I'm surprised you didn't mention it. That before the decision to go for the limiting method, there's this period of non-use that seemed incredibly high. I found that very surprising. Was that expected? But you're saying we're saying there's a period where there's a risk of unintended pregnancy before you actually make the final decision to go for limiting.
Yeah, so this was something like also has like come out when we were doing the exercise and we were doing the analysis. So the ideal, the scenario should be women should be using something and then go for a limiting, go for sterilization if they have this in mind that after like having 3 like children I will go for sterilization. But this just as I said, this again puts them in the risk of unintended pregnancy, and we should try to focus on those women who are reporting that they are not using but then going for a limiting method. So there is scope for more work, I would say.
I
Yeah.
actually have a question about that.
Can we focus on that for a bit? Yeah. Wait for the microphone because we've got people online, possibly hundreds.
Sorry. No, the surprises is not there because, you know, in India, I mean, still we see very seasonality in sterilization. See, one is that in India, still female sterilization is the prominent method. There is a seasonality. Women wait for winter season when there are, like, you know, increased services, though government has put in more efforts to make it accessible throughout the year, but still the pattern is very much skewed towards, like, you know, during the winter season more sterilization happen because of so many specific reasons. So that's where you'll see that even if there is a need for sterilization, women prefers to wait for certain time to go for, instead of, not like, you know, not everybody would go immediately after the birth of the last child once they have completed their family size.
But you would expect some kind of contraceptive use. I think that was a comment. But Holly, what was your point?
Well, my question was, how are you defining? So there was the category of people who was non-use, and then there was after birth. So what were you deciding as defining after birth as being? Like, how long was that period? Because were some of those non-use women maybe people who had passed that point but were still breastfeeding, or, you know, were, yeah, maybe within sort of a proximal period around the birth?
Yeah, so I used calendar data as I mentioned. So what happens in the reproductive calendar is there is data for each month. So if a woman has given birth, that will be recorded as an event in the calendar, and what she has done in immediately the next month will also be recorded as an event. So what I did is I identified where women has said that in this month she has gone for sterilization. So I looked at the previous event. So what she was doing in the previous month. So from that I have like calculated. So if it is immediately after birth, then it is, I have classified it as after giving birth. If they're mentioning any method of spacing, there may be anything, I have not specified the method, but they're using some method before the month of sterilization, so then it is like using spacing method. And if it is reported as non-use, the previous month, so it is defined as a yes, that is a method, yeah, as a method, yeah.
But here it's not lamb. So if suppose interviewer is asking this question and woman said that she's using like breastfeeding and that's why she is not using any method, and says lamb, then it will be recorded as lamb. Lamb is one of the methods. So she has considered, like when she's saying that non-use means even lamb is not being used. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. It just shows you how important this research is as it throws up things. Holly, the question was to you as well. What was surprising?
Yes, we didn't forget your question. The previous study that we had done in this context didn't really highlight mother-in-laws. At that time, I actually found that surprising, but we kind of went into this not thinking that mother-in-laws might be that important. And having, for me, a lot of sort of background in South Asia, I was trying to be careful not to project that expectation onto that context. But then it turned out in the qualitative interviews that mother-in-laws did end up being, you know, an important consideration. I was also sort of surprised that we couldn't really get a clear picture around the role of co-wives. And there seemed to be sensitivity about it, and then sometimes it was brought in as important, and then sometimes people said, "Oh, don't talk about it." So that was sort of surprising that we wasn't really able to get like a clear picture or narrative around the role of co-wives in women's fertility choices, their norms, and their interactions in that way.
Yeah, could I come in on, because I thought a few things were surprising. I mean, when you comment around the gender equity and where it is, it feels, as you say, so far removed from where the program might be. But there is that interesting dimension, which you've been commenting on, come through from the study in India as well, about the mother-in-law seeming incredibly powerful. And I don't know, maybe I misunderstood it, but it sounded to me like whatever the men wanted, or their uncle or their father, it was a mother-in-law that really held the keys to family size. If she were convinced that a smaller family would be better for her son and his wife, then that would be the thing that happened. The other thing that I thought was really surprising is the fact that everybody accepts that family planning is a good thing. and that it, but pretty much it was accepted and available. Holly, can you some Mike? Yeah.
Uses family planning, that could be a sign of being promiscuous or whatnot. But in general, people were not, there are so many family planning programs around, I think, that people don't overall need to be convinced that taking some sort of family planning could be beneficial under the right context. Okay, here. So straight to was with me, so.
So, how I interpret that is kind of like people are beyond the like they don't conceive negative effects of family planning.
Yes.
So contraceptives themselves are not bad. That is what now people understand. But using contraceptive has to be under certain circumstances, which is under husband's approval, after reaching your certain fertility desire, or at least having one child. So yeah, there are no myths around contraception, but usage is.
Yeah. It's interesting. We're talking more and more about social norms. You know, I mean, lots of different fora are talking about family planning. Am I right? And it's a very. I've always thought it's very simplistic to say. You often hear it's about supply, and increasingly you've been hearing it's about the demand. So, but I mean, what these studies show is that you can have the supply, the access, and the demand. I.e., people know that it's there and they want to use it. But there are these social norms. These are the constraints which are much more difficult to deal with. I don't know if you would say a little bit more about what. I mean, what the next steps in how you're going to kind of address the social norms when you say you need to work with different. The network and the mother-in-laws and so on. What does that mean in terms of what the program will look
in this
like?
case, it's fairly simple because it's an RCT. If we mess too much up, we don't know what we're testing against what, right? So there's the standard program. This program has been tested before in a different area of Niger with an RCT and seemed promising. This is a combination of using household visits, small group discussions, and community dialogues. It's a triad of intervention components that they're going to be using in this big Kalawa integrated health program. So basically, having done our formative research, we had a lot of discussions about this. Do we do a social network approach that focuses on peers? So are we taking young adolescent wives and finding their friends and involving them in this program? Or are we going to take somebody who's a decision maker and has seniority? And we discuss this a lot. The thing is that young adolescent wives are about the social normatively least empowered people in the entire community. You can't be any lower in terms of social power than a young adolescent who just got married and has moved into her husband's house. So trying to get her friends on board may just not be leveraging social power that you would get by taking a person that's in authority. The other thing about mother-in-laws is that mother-in-laws have their own daughters. So we see that women in these communities their mothers still have influence with them. They still have relationships with their mothers. They go to their mothers to talk about these things. So taking a mother-in-law, this mother-in-law potentially has influence within her own, like, son's family, but also within her daughter's family, which kind of gets to this question that you were talking about in gender equity, that yes, there are senior women that have a lot of power within certain domains, this potentially, being one of them. And this is an issue between gender and age hierarchy. And women do attain power, and in India we see this quite a bit. Once a woman becomes a mother-in-law, there's an additional level of power that she has that she didn't have before. And this is a sort of this gets at really the life course. At the point where a woman is older, her son is getting married, and she has a daughter-in-law, now she's stepped into a different domain of power and influence.
Yeah, it's so incredibly interesting. We've got a comment coming in from the back. As you come to that, I mean, it almost sounds like that these adolescent girls get the power through having the children. you know, the status and the power comes from the children that you have, the number of children you have. I mean, do come in.
I think we should be a bit careful how we interpret those findings and the results. The fact that the older women have power, that power could actually be to undermine effective use of contraception. Yeah, and it's also important to think about younger women may need different the support they get from their peers may give them some level of resilience and opportunity to actually withstand some of those initial influences that may come in. And so how we interpret it does matter a great deal. In some of the work we did many decades ago does show that actually in the very first, let's say, 10 years of marriage, you look at the influences of husbands and wives on each other's preferences, and it's really nothing. Because everybody is committed to having the first 2, 3, 4 children or whatever. But once you get to 10 to 15, 20 years of marriage or past 4 children, you begin to see divergence of preferences, and that's where the influence of the men become much stronger. The influence of the women become long after 20 years of marriage, but the woman is no longer fecund, and that influence is actually in the younger women, and oftentimes is not supporting their use of contraception and things like that. So
Yes, that's actually why the mother-in-law is being enrolled into the intervention for that exact reason. Because if the mother-in-law is undermining the contraceptive use, then that can cause a big problem. If the mother-in-law is drawn into the intervention and has the opportunity to engage in the dialogues and think about these things from different perspectives, then the hope is that the mother-in-law influence can be positive rather than the mother-in-law, like you said, undermining. And then the last aspect of this intervention is that there's this sort of adopt a friend approach where each young woman that's enrolled will identify a friend that she'll be sort of tasked with talking to this about. And so to sort of open up that dialogue among those peers. So sort of addressing it at 2 levels, but really putting more of the focus on the mother-in-law.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. It's just and you're absolutely right about making assumptions, but my point, we sometimes, you know, put the sexes into categories where we say all women are powerless, and none of them have a decision, you know, don't have agency to choose their, you know, over their bodies. But maybe these mother-in-laws, these older women, may well have that and may hold the key to it. And maybe it's the young men who feel that they're being influenced by their mother. Although that study in India is interesting about when the mother-in-law and the father, the son, disagree, it actually gives the wife more agency. But it's very hard when that was what you were saying, wasn't it? Space, yeah. Yeah, maybe I used too strong a word. Anyway, all of that means how important this work is, and how we have to stick to the data and not even when we've got the data, we need to interrogate it and not make assumptions and do more work to try and understand what really is happening. But I found that very interesting, and will certainly follow up on some of that. And it's certainly helped me to think about this life course and what happens and how I was quite shocked by the stats in Nigeria, I have to say. That it was 80-something% are married. Yeah, by them. Okay, I won't have the last word. I'll let Holly and Gagoli have the last word. Anything you would like to say before we close? Final comments?
Yeah, no, but thank you for all the suggestions and discussions. So these are the things that come up. Sometimes we also miss something, like while we are doing, and also under the pressure of putting everything for a presentation of 15 minutes, we tend to miss out. But yeah, all your suggestions are very helpful while we are developing this work further. And yeah, we will take care of all your suggestions and try to see what additional or yeah we can do. But thank you.
And Holly?
Just that, as this highlights, it's an extremely complex dynamic. Every context is different, and that we go in with appreciation, respect for the populations that we're working with, and hopefully we can reflect their desires and respect their wishes and their aspirations and do work that helps them achieve that.
Yeah, excellent final comment. Thank you, and both of you. Wonderful presentations, as I say, really. And thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for the questions, comments. The presentations will be online in a couple of weeks on conference side.